Do you struggle with controlling weeds? I sure do. I think every gardener does. Today I'm going to share with you the importance of getting ahead of your weed problem and 12 ways to control your weeds organically. Let's get growing. Hello and welcome to the Pray Just Plant podcast, the show that talks about growing a garden, a homestead, a healthy family, and most importantly, growing closer to God. I'm your host, Crystal Media, owner of the Red Ridge Farm Homestead, where our mission is to help women of faith find the courage to grow healthy food for their family while building a closer relationship with our Lord and Savior. If that's you, don't let the world hold you back. Pray Just Plant. Welcome to the Pray Just Plant podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Media, and today in season 2, Episode 6, we're going to be talking about controlling weeds organically and why it's so important to get ahead of your weed problem. One of my greatest failures as a gardener was not taking my weed problem seriously. I was raised with the adage, a weed is a plant you didn't want to, so just pull it up and move on. I wish I would have learned that preventing my problem before it started was the answer, which reminds me of a quote by Ben Franklin, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I could have been using different gardening techniques to prevent weeds instead of the easy way out of tilling and forgetting it till next spring. I found I was even helping some of my weeds multiply. I think our greatest defense on our war on weeds, yes, I really think it is a war, is weed identification. Understanding and knowing who you're up against or what their weaknesses is the most important asset when it comes to our battle on weeds. And the easiest way to prevent something is by identifying it and getting to the root of the problem really quickly. And with weeds, that's not really figurative. It's literal. We can really get to the root of those problems. So what is a weed? According to the Weed Science Society of America, there are 3 different weed definitions. Weed, a plant that causes economic loss or ecological damage, creates health problems for humans or animals, or is undesirable where it is growing. So I know that's pretty much the weed that I battle in my garden is a plant that is taking nutrients from the vegetables that I want to grow and is essentially a plant that I just don't desire to grow in my garden. Another definition is a noxious weed, and that's any plant designated by federal, state, or local government officials as injurious to public health, agriculture, recreation, wildlife, or property. Once a weed is classified as a noxious weed, authorities can implement quarantines and take other actions to contain or destroy the weed and limit its spread. I know we have several noxious weeds and even noxious trees here in Wyoming. So make sure that when you're adding anything to your property, make sure that it's not on the noxious weed, or I think it's called noxious weed list or noxious tree list. We have a noxious tree that sadly someone before we even moved here planted 2 of them on our property. They're called the Russian olive trees, and they were brought over, I believe, from Russia. And what's noxious about them is their ability to spread really quickly, and also they grow really fast. So my Russian olives make this nice little almost like olive seed, and the birds love them. So that's how they spread really quickly is the birds eat them, and then they take their seed and then they poop the seed out because the seed isn't digestible, and it grows more of this tree. And it became noxious because they were finding that it was starting to take over some of our native habitats. Just make sure you go and check out you should be able to go to your local agriculture or local feed store, and they should have a list of noxious weeds in your area. And another one is invasive weeds. So that's a little bit of noxious too, but an invasive weed is a weeds that establish and persist and spread wildly in a natural ecosystem outside of the plant's native range. When in a foreign environment, these invaders often lack natural enemies to curtail their growth, which allows them to overrun native plants and ecosystems. You could probably think, well, why is that important? Why is a plant that's not native to your area detrimental? And so one plant that I can think of that's even more detrimental than this olive tree, because in a way you think, well, it's feeding the birds. But hundreds of years ago, when China began mailing China, the actual plates, to America, they used to pack them with what was called cheat grass and what we like to call cheek grass. So cheat, and as like cheat on a test, and cheek like your cheek on your face. Because when this grass begins to grow, it's very evasive, and it also has a larger seed than most of our native grasses. The problem is with this grass is that when that seed head gets very hard, it has a kind of hook on it. And so when wildlife and even cattle, horses, goats go to eat it, it actually can lodge itself in the cheek. That's why we call it cheek grass, in the cheek of that animal, and slowly give them an abscess or hurt them in some way, and they'll eventually stop eating. And then we've had several times where we've had to take a cow to the vet, and it was because of cheatgrass, and we even have some here on our property. Another detrimental thing about cheatgrass is when I was a hay contractor, probably don't know that about me, but when I was just out of high school, one of the first businesses that I started with my father was doing hay contracting, and that's where I own the equipment to do haying, to put up hay, and I would go to other people's property that didn't own the equipment, and I would hay for them. I would put up their hay for them. And when I had to go into a field that had cheatgrass in it, and it was at its driest point, and when I would go through it to cut it, it makes kind of a black, oily dust as you go through it. And so it's really hard on haying equipment. And so this plant is not native to America, but it is growing everywhere. Every state has cheatgrass on its invasive weed list. It came from China hundreds of years ago when we first were ordering like their plates. That's what they used for packing. Like we use peanuts nowadays, we use styrofoam peanuts, but that's what they used back then. And so it has traveled very fast across America, Canada, everywhere. So those are the three definitions of a weed. So in our garden, we deal with the simple weed of it's a plant that's taking from our plants and we just don't want them there. Now, when we also look at weeds, we can also see that there are two different types, as in annual weeds and perennial weeds. And the perennial weeds are the ones that are the most difficult to control. Most of these need to be either dug up by the roots, or they have underground tubers or rhizomes, which do not overkill through the winter. And new weeds can grow from any piece that is broken off of the remaining tuber in the soil. There are several of these that I battle in my garden. Bindweed is one of them. Quickgrass is one of them. Canadian thistle, white top. So what this means is that every single time we till, every single time winter comes and spring arrives, these weeds not only are growing by the seeds that they produce, but they can actually live in the soil through the winter. So it's really hard for a gardener to get ahead of these weeds without a little more control of getting ahead of them. And we're going to talk about those tools in just a moment. But first, we are going to jump into the tips and tricks segment of this episode, where I share with you a few bonus tips and tricks I use here at Red Ridge Farm. And the tip for this week is brought to you by Dirt, Building Your Soil Health ebook. And this book was wrote and developed to help you walk through the steps of building your soil health from start to finish. So the tip for this week is using a rain gauge. Now, rain gauge can help you in your garden, it can help you on your homestead, and it can help you in developing a rainwater system. So first, let's look at a garden. So a few weeks ago, I wrote a blog post about how you as a gardener can be a better gardener if you can understand your soil type. And I'll put the link to this blog post in the description. By knowing your soil type, you can easily look at, like for myself, I grow in clay soil. So clay soil absorbs water slowly, and it also keeps water or holds water longer. So when I water my garden, I can use a rain gauge to measure how much water I've put on my garden, because the garden needs about about a half inch of precipitation a week. And then I can also measure how long I watered to get that amount. And then I can also look at how well that amount of water and how quickly it absorbed into my soil. So a rain gauge can help you so that you can develop a watering system specific to your soil type. And it's also going to, in the garden, it's going to make sure that you're not overwatering, you're not underwatering, and you're just giving your garden exactly what it needs, which is about a half inch a week. Now, on your homestead, one thing that when you are developing your homestead or improving your homestead, the number one product you have that will help you grow pretty much anything is grass, or what your soil provides for your animals to eat. One way to improve your pasture is to plant native plants and native grasses that are going to grow well in your pastures. And when you're looking up those seeds, they're going to ask you, is this dry land? Is this irrigated land? Is it something in between? And give you a measure of how much water that plant is going to need per year. So with your rain gauge, keeping track of how much exact rain you get on your property is going to help you pick those seeds that you need to improve your pasture. Also, with improving your pasture, you can look at, we live on a hill, and so by knowing how much rain I get at the top of the hill or how much rain our property gets, I can look into infrastructures that can help us control rainwater. One, because I know the volume that we're going to get in a big storm and how much I need to contain. Is building a pond going to be useful? Does my property get enough water to do that? And a rain gauge is going to help you out. Another thing a rain gauge is also going to do when you're building a rainwater system, and I talk about building a rainwater system a few episodes ago, and I promise I will put the link to that in the show notes as well. But when you have a specific measurement of how much rain you've gotten during a storm, you can measure exactly how much rain can be harvested off of your roof. So then you can actually gauge of how big a system you need or how small a system you need. And what's really great about a rainwater system is it's naturally refilling. So we just went ahead and purchased a very large tank. But if I have a rainwater gauge and know the calculations, which I talk about the calculations in that podcast episode, that if I know those calculations, I can easily calculate how much water actually filled in that tank without having to try to figure out some way to measure it. So those are the kind of 4 ways that a rain gauge, and they're very simple, they're very cheap, they're very easy to use. So you want to make sure you get one that can be stationary, that you watch all the time, and one that can be moved, especially in the garden. My garden is shaped more like a Z or an L, so it's nice to have this extra rain gauge that I can put in certain parts of my garden when I'm watering it to make sure I'm keeping track of the amount of precipitation or irrigation my plants need. So let's get back to talking about weeds. So I have a quick story for you. I've told you a little bit about some invasive weeds, and I've told you about noxious weeds, and I've told you definition of weeds. I've talked about perennial weeds. So I want to talk about a perennial weed that I mentioned earlier called bindweed. Now, if you want to get a list of about the top 9 weeds that most gardeners battle and their weaknesses, you can go to a blog post that I wrote called The 9 Most Common Weeds We All Fight and Their Weaknesses. And you can find that on my website at www.redridgefarm.org. But I want to talk about bindweed and kind of give you an idea of how you could find their weaknesses, because I'm going to be sharing some tools, or not really tools, but some ways or methods that you can use to battle these weeds. But you have to understand that each weed has different tools in its that he can use in his battle, or it can use in its battle, to help spread and grow and take over your garden. So bindweed is a very hardy perennial. Remember, I talked about how perennial is a plant that comes back, and even weeds come back every year. There's different common names for bindweed like wild morning glory or creeping jenny or sheep bind or corn bind and bell bind. And this weed spreads by rootstock and seed. Those are its 2 tools. It spreads by its rootstock and its seeds. Bindweed is classified as the toughest weed to eliminate once it takes hold. Their rootstock bed can be found as deep as 14 feet deep. There's no way my hoe is going to get that far. There's no way even a rototiller would get that far. This weed, if left unattended, can grow rapidly to more than 10 feet in a single growing season. Now, it's said that it had 2 ways that it spreads. So, as I said before, our biggest tool and our best tool and the first thing we need to do when we are looking at controlling our weeds is we need to identify them, because we need to be able to find their weaknesses. So, sadly, this is a weed that I've been battling in my garden. And in fact, the way I've been treating it the past 10 years or so has actually made it worse. When I've just barely switched, it was about 2 years ago, I really made the commitment. I told myself years and years ago that I was going to go to no-till. And it's really hard once you're a tiller to go to no-till, because that's a whole nother story. But anyways, I used to till my garden every single spring. And that tilling was actually only aggravating this root because it spreads through its stalk or roots. And every time that rototiller went in there and tore up their roots and put it into tiny little pieces, I actually was making a new plant. So I was tilling every single spring, and this plant it's taken over my area because I didn't take this struggle seriously. I didn't identify why I was having such a strong problem with this plant, and that I myself was making some of that problem. So by using different ways that can help me stop the spread of this plant, find its weaknesses, which its best assets, its best tools are actually its weaknesses. So when I look at that it can spread by root, that means that I need to stop tilling it, and I need to stop aggravating the soil or even using a hoe or digging it up, because I need to stop breaking that root apart. And the next thing is I need to make sure that it doesn't go to seed. So seeds is the other way it spreads. In fact, a bindweed can lay down, I think it was like 500 seeds per flower. Yeah, there's a lot. So this weed has very good, strong tools. So now that we've talked about one weed, now remember you can get a list of 9 different weeds in that blog post that I'm going to share with you in the show notes. By taking that information from that one weed, identifying its weaknesses, we can then go into the ways that we can control these weeds. But one thing I want to say before we get into controlling these weeds organically is that organic herbicides, I don't believe, are the answer. I mean, they have their place, but I don't think they have their place in our garden. So usually if you were to look up an organic herbicide recipe, they use salt and they use vinegar. And using both of these, yes, they're going to kill the plant, but I think they also have other problems, like too much salt in the soil can actually slow or even stop seed germination. And vinegar is an acid that kills by sucking moisture out of plants. So my thought there with that, both of those really, is if you read my book, Dirt, Finding the Solution to Building Soil Health, or even listen to the series that we've been talking about in this season about soil health, the second way we measure soil health is by the organisms in my soil. So if salt and vinegar are going to kill my plants, can't they not also kill the microorganisms in my soil? I really think even natural herbicides are just not the solution. So first we have to identify our plant. We have to identify who we're going into battle with. So let's talk about those different ways. Now there's 12 of them, and I'm going to give you a hint that number 12 is my favorite. So the very first way that we can get ahead of our weeds is topping. So topping is when you either weed eat or cut down a weed, not necessarily pull it, before they have a chance to ripen and drop their seeds. So that was definitely something that I used against bindweed. Way number 2 is plant spacing. So in an organic garden, or any garden really, if you put your plants closer together, then weeds really can't grow in between them. So weeds are a nuisance in a garden because they steal nutrients and they crowd out vegetables that we want to grow. But if we place our vegetables close together, we in fact change the role of the weeds. Our vegetables now will crowd out the weeds by robbing them of the nutrients and light and space. God said the world would be covered with vegetation. So when we leave bare places between our plants, those bare places or spaces will fill in with weeds. And if you look on the back of your seed packet, it gives you a proper distance for your spacing. But one thing you need to remember is that spacing is for rows, not beds. So when you're planting in beds, spacing is going to be more off of a radius instead of a distance. So for example, if I'm supposed to put peppers a foot apart in rows in a bed system, that means I can put them about 6 inches apart and still maintain 12 inches spacing in a radius. So that plant is the center point of that circle. And you're going to go out 6 inches before you hit the other plant. And between the two plants, you're going to have 12 inches. So that's still going to have the space it needs. Another example would be like tomatoes. In my garden system, they need about 18 to 24 inches space. For me, that means I would place one row in the center of my 30-inch bed. But alongside that, why couldn't I plant something else? You can easily plant a short season crop like lettuce or marigolds. And by the time that tomato reaches full maturity, the other crop will have been harvested and removed. So you're using that space to grow something you want to grow there instead of something you don't want to grow there. Way number 3 is no-till or reduced till. So I talked about that a little bit before, and if you want to learn about more of my struggles about moving to no-till or even talking about no-till, then you can definitely check out my ebook. But for years in my garden, I've been using the tilling method. As I told you before, every spring I would till. And the problem with this method is that, one, as an organic gardener, I'm destroying the structure of my soil. Remember, soil is what we are growing. When we grow a garden, our everything, even the pastures, anything, when we're growing, the most important thing we need to take care of is the soil, because that's what produces the food that we eat. That's what produces those good vegetables in our garden. That's what produces the grass for our animals to eat. So soil is our most important asset. And so when we till, we break up that structure. And 2, weeds like bindweed thrive and spread faster. And 3, I'm pulling up new seeds from the seed bank. So like I said before, when that bindweed put out 500 different seeds, not all of them may germinate in 1 year. Some of them may go and settle down in the soil. And so every time we till, we bring up those new seeds to the surface, and then they do want to sprout. They do want to get what they need because they're getting the warmth, they're getting the water, they're getting everything they need to grow into great plants. And a seed can lay dormant for hundreds of years. I've even heard that they have planted wheat from seeds stored in an Egyptian tomb. So just remember that God destined for the world to be covered. So deep down in your soil, there's going to be, that could be 6 inches to 3 feet down, there's a seed bank. And every time you till, you bring up more seeds. They just get to see the sunlight and they get to mature. So over the past 3 years, I've been really trying, it's been hard, but I've been really trying to switch over to no-till. I've made beds, so now I'm only needing to rake the top couple inches and mix in compost and amendments, and I'm not doing that deep tilling that I was doing every year before. But I will let you in, if this is like the first year that you're going to decide to go to no-till. When you first begin no-till, you're going to have heavier weed pressure than you will ever have. And that's only because you've been bringing up these seeds for so many years, and they're just going to all grow at once when you go that first couple years of no-till. So you're going to need to use some other methods that I'm going to be talking about with you to help you get through that first couple of years, because tilling is so easy to fall back into because it's going to help you get rid of that problem, right? But just be aware. I just wanted to tell you that going to no-till is just not as easy as one might think. And also, when you first begin a garden, yes, you are going to need to till so that you can add air to your soil. And it is definitely okay for you to do that first couple of years, just to make sure you're breaking up your soil and getting it used to being worked. And then after that, you can very easily move into a no-till system. So way number 4 would be having fertile soil. So like we talked about before, our soil is our greatest asset. And you can easily improve your soil. So by improving your soil fertility, you can eliminate lots of weeds that prefer to grow in low fertile soil. So make sure you get into that weed identification, because it's the secret to all of these different methods. Because once you find out more about these weeds and understand how they even grow, like weeds like white top and bindweed and many others, they like to grow in certain soil conditions. So those soil conditions are most usually of their low fertile soil. And so by improving your soil, you're going to make conditions for these weeds where they just don't want to grow on them, and so they won't. For instance, if you go even deeper into that aspect of it, you can get into dandelions. One way you can control dandelions in your lawn is by changing the pH of your soil just slightly. So dandelions like a Pacific pH and grass like another pH. They're very close to each other. Like I think one's like 6.5 and the other one's like 7. So it's very easy to do this. But by changing that pH of your soil just slightly, you'll be able to make it less likely for those dandelions to germinate because they just don't like the situation that they're in. So they just won't grow. Same goes for soil fertility. And then way number 5 is precise watering. So I currently I've been using sprinklers for years. So when you use sprinklers or overhead sprinkling, you're watering everything. You're watering the paths, you're watering the edge of your garden, you're watering every part of your garden. And that means if you have a little weed seed in the middle of the path, it's going to get watered too. So having a precise watering, things like using soaker hose or a drip line water system, is going to centralize your water only on your veggies. And this lessens the chance of your weeds getting the amount of water they need and therefore reduces your weeds. So over sprinklers, if you're a new gardener though, overhead sprinklers are the easiest and cheapest option for you to get into. And I would just suggest that when you first start getting into a garden, just do that. Just do the overhead sprinklers, but just be aware that you're going to have to be, dealing with a little bit more weeds, and also be aware that you want to slowly eventually transition to using soaker hoses or drip lines in your garden. It doesn't have to be done as soon as you start your garden. It can be done over time because they're going to also help you in having more efficient watering, lower maintenance watering, because you can easily set them on a timer, and it's going to be a lot easier. But do not put that pressure on yourself when you're first starting to garden. Just go ahead and do the overhead sprinklers, but just be aware that eventually you do want to and are going to need to try to get away from those sprinklers per se and try to go into more precise watering to eliminate some of those weeds. So the next is number 6 is cover crops. So cover crops can be used in the off season or as an interplanting with your veggies to help reduce weeds. Remember, the Lord will cover the earth. So why not put something in that you want to grow there? So cover crops will cover the soil with plants you choose, and that can be beneficial to your soil, and it can also be beneficial to your compost pile as green manures. For example, and you can even do interplanting. When I plant my squash or my pumpkins, I undersow them with clover and field peas. Clover is a great green manure, and peas fix nitrogen in the soil. So pumpkins usually spread out and make their own natural mulching, and they'll eventually smother out my clover and peas. So I usually plant them, when the pumpkin's very small. And then as the pumpkin grows and does its own thing, it's going to eventually smother out this clover and these peas. But that's still going to be fine, because instead of having a weed that gets smothered out, it's going to be something that is already going to be benefiting my soil while it grows. Where a weed's only going to be taking nutrients, a cover crop could be giving nutrients. And cover crops in the off season can be used to suppress weeds when you're not using that bed. There's several types of cover crops like ryegrass that will actually send out a hormone from its roots that don't let any other seeds germinate. Usually this hormone only lasts as long as the crop is in the ground. Cover crops are so amazing. It is now time for the Growing with God segment of this episode, where you and I talk about building a relationship with our Lord and Savior. Now, this week's verse comes from Deuteronomy 31:6. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them. The Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Now, this part of the Bible is a continuance of a story of when the Israelites left Egypt and then spent their time in the desert for 40 years. And this is a piece of Moses' speech to the Israelites telling them that they are about to go into the new land and they're about to lose him because he's not coming with them. They are actually going to be going under a new leader, Joshua. So they're about to leave the desert, leave their trials and tribulations and go into this new land. But this new land is not going to just be free. There's going to be things that they're going to have to do to essentially take this new land that the Lord is giving them. But what we can pull from this, what we can learn from this story is that when we're on that track of doing the new thing, doing the growing our own food or building a homestead and moving away from the conventional world, just like the Israelites are about to do, we can understand, because in that same verse, he's saying, don't be afraid. Don't worry about these things. He also says the Lord is going with you. Just because I, myself, Moses, isn't going with you, it doesn't mean that you are going alone. The Lord is going to go with you. So sometimes when we break away from the conventional world, sometimes our friends and families don't understand our journey. They don't see why it's necessary, why we think that growing food and growing a homestead and growing closer to God is necessary. And sometimes there's going to be some pullback. And sometimes there's going to be just pulling away from them, just like the Israelites had to pull away from Moses. But we also have the thought that, and Moses even tells them, you're not going alone. Just because maybe a friend doesn't agree with what you're doing, that doesn't mean you're doing it alone. You're going to be going into growing food and growing a homestead, and these things are hard things, and they're going to be easier, and they're going to be going with the Lord, and having that assurance that he's going to go with you is going to give you that courage and give you that strength that you need to step forward and to step into that new thing. Step into doing something new. Step into doing something that could be hard, but deep down in your heart that it's going to be good for your family. So I just want you to remember that when you are on this journey of growing, that you be strong and courageous, and do not be afraid or terrified because of the world or of others. But remember that the Lord your God goes with you, and he will never leave you nor forsake you. Deuteronomy 31:6. So let's get back to that list of ways to control weeds organically. Now, I just want to recap really quick. And we've talked about the importance of identifying that weed so that we can see that weakness, so that we can match these methods to those weaknesses. So way number 7 is crop rotation. So crop rotation helps in many different ways, but with weeds, it helps you implement different weed controlling methods in different beds. For example, if I put in broccoli that is 18 inches apart, and I have plenty of space to get in there with a hoe and weed more aggressively. But if I have put in carrots that are planted close together and are a little harder to weed, then I can't weed them as aggressively. But by rotating these crops, I also rotate my aggressiveness of weeding also. That probably sounds clear as mud, but what I'm trying to say is when you rotate your crops, you are also rotating your different weed methods to other beds, in result giving a more evenly weeded garden. The next way is flame weeding. Flame weeding is when you use a torch to burn and dry up small weed seedlings. For example, carrots usually take 7 to 21 days to germinate. So while your carrots are still germinating, weeds are going to sprout ahead of your carrots. But you can't really do anything but hand weed. Or you can use a flame weeder to burn up those seedlings, and the carrots seeds will be unharmed because they're under the soil. So how you would do this is you'd plant your carrot seeds, and then about 7 days later, before your carrots emerge, you're going to see those little seedlings. So then you could use your torch or your burner and burn those seedlings off. And then your carrots will probably germinate the next week. And I'm sure that this method will save you tons of times and maybe even your back and knees from hand weeding. So way number 9 is mulching. Because I rotate my vegetables in my garden, I struggle with using mulch in my beds. But mulch is a great solution for paths, especially in between raised beds, because you can lay down a good weed barrier and cover it with your mulch of choice. Mulch works especially well in the past if you use overhead sprinklers. So this is going to be a great solution for you beginner gardeners. When you're using overhead sprinklers, because the paths get as much water as the beds, and so they usually have the same amount of weeds as the beds. Because this mulch is covering up those weed seeds, even though they're getting watered, they're not getting the sun they need, and therefore they just can't grow. I currently use my bedding from our baby chicks we raise every spring. And for my potatoes, I mulch with straw. So there's some plants that you can mulch, and I suggest you do mulch. The last thing I want to say about mulching is you want to make sure that your mulch is going to be weed free. The last thing you want to do is buy a mulch to control weeds, and then your new mulch is full of more weeds. Straw may be one of those things, but it's also great to mulch around you can use mulch in your flower beds and around trees. I love to, especially around trees, lay down some cardboard as my weed barrier and then use old hay on top of that. Actually, it's newspaper, cardboard, and then old hay. So way number 10 is boiling water. So boiling water is a more concentrated solution for taking out just one weed. Remember that it will take out any plant that it is poured on. One weed that I specifically use this method on is tobacco weed. It has a really deep taproot that goes down 3 to 4 feet. So boiling water is not only going to shock that plant, but its deep roots as well. Here is how you use the boiling water method. So you get a pot with really sturdy handle and fill it with water. Place it on the stove and bring it to the water to a boil. Carry the pot of water out to the weed you want to kill. Make sure you wear gloves and your kids and pets are out of the way. So do this at night, nap time, or do this when the kids are very well distracted. Then take the boiling water and pour it directly on the base of the plant. That heat of the water will shock the plant and kill it. If it doesn't, you may have to repeat this method several times. So way number 11, and we're almost to my favorite way. So way number 11 is corn gluten meal. So corn gluten meal is used to suppress germination. I personally do not use this method, but it can be used in flower beds and places that you want to stop germination of seeds. Remember, this will stop germination of all seeds. So if you have flower beds that spread by seed, this will also stop them from germinating as well. So here is way number 12. This is my favorite way. So this way is called tarping, or AKA solarization. The method of tarping is used by laying down a thick silage type tarp that will not let any light in, and it's preferably black, on top of an area before you plant your vegetables for at least 3 to 4 weeks. So you're going to lay down this tarp. I use it every spring. Now that I've moved over to no-till, this has been a really easy way for me to keep control of weeds while I'm waiting for the soil to warm up. So I lay these thick tarps over all my beds. Currently right now, in the first week of May, my garden, anything that's not being planted into new spring crops is covered with these tarps. And they've been in place since mid-March, so that nothing is really growing underneath there because nothing is getting sunlight. And just to give you a little more information about what solarization is, solarization is when that soil, the first 2 inches of your soil, warm up a little bit more than they needs to, and it, in having that warm up, is going to kill any seeds down there before they germinate. And if they do make it through the germination process, then that heat will also kill the plants. So solarization is my favorite method or favorite tool, just because it is just so simple to implement. And it is even great for controlling cover crops. If you were to put in a cover crop and you cut it down in the fall, and then that next spring it started to come up, putting this tarps over it is going to do the same thing that it would do to weeds, and it's going to be a great way for you to incorporate cover crops into your no-till garden. And it's a great way to stop that weed cycle, especially if you have weeds that spread by root and by seed. So to recap everything, when you're starting that battle against weeds, the first thing you want to do is you want to identify that weed. And I have a great blog post that'll help you identify the top 9, which I'll include in the description box. You want to identify that weed so that you know how it spreads, because how it spreads can be its best assets, but it can also be its greatest weaknesses. When you know those weaknesses, then you can easily implement one of these 12 methods to help you get ahead of your weed problem. I want to thank you for joining me here at the Pray Just Plant podcast. If this is your first time, I want to welcome you to the Red Ridge Farm community of fellow growers. And as always, don't let the world hold you back. Pray Just Plant.